I win the award for the longest title of a talk with this one. Genetic Entropy, the Death Knell of Biological Evolution and Other Biological Reasons Why Evolution is False and the Traditional Catholic Doctrine of Creation is True. So Darwin, back in the 1830s, he left from England and he sailed to the Galapagos Islands aboard the HMS Beagle, among other stops, and he brought back a variety of finches. And these finches are famous because the finch beaks variated in size from large to small. It seemed to change depending on the season. And so it was seen as basically an example of evolution in action. And it has been called the best and most detailed demonstration to date of the power of Darwin's process, the most intense episode of natural selection ever documented in nature, the most detailed, unified support to the neo-Darwinian view of evolution that the theory has yet received. So let's look at these finches. Darwin inferred common descent based on natural selection. If there's 14 different finch species, and they're all finches, then perhaps they descended from a common ancestor, and that natural selection is responsible for the differences. Well, most creationists would basically agree with this, that the various finches probably did descend from an original pair of finches, limited variation being God's design. So where do we disagree? Well, we first have to talk about what do we even mean by the word evolution. And it can be defined various ways. The process by which different kinds of living organisms are thought to have developed and diversified from earlier forms during the history of Earth, the change in hereditable characteristics of biological populations over successive generations, and the change in the gene pool of the population from generation to generation by such processes as mutation, natural selection, and genetic drift. Well, if these are the definitions of evolution, then you could probably call me an evolutionist because I don't really have a lot of problem with these. But the problem is when you are talking about evolution, of course, what is attempted to be proved here is this idea of an upward natural process that increases information in the genetics of organisms, resulting in increased complexity in function over successive generations, ultimately causing one kind of creature to give rise to another kind. From moo to you by way of the zoo. So what were the genetics that drove finch speciation? Well, in the evolution framework, they believe that the early finches that gave rise to the rest of the finches their genetics were more basic. That all novel variation in finches are due to random mutations that have increased genetic information, in addition to natural selection working on them. While creationists say that the original finches had genetics that were more advanced than the modern finches, because mutations have actually caused the loss in genetic information over time. And that the original finches could be considered some of the originally created kinds, which with a large amount of inbuilt potential genetic variability. Genetic information doesn't increase with time, but in fact, research has shown that genetic information in organisms degrades with time. So our second disagreement involves whether the variation evident among the finches can be extrapolated to all creatures. And since finches have a common ancestor, does that mean that you can extrapolate that to all creatures? Well, evolutionists, of course, say yes to both of those, that there's no limits to organisms' ability to vary given enough time. And they believe that evolution increases genetic information resulting in potentially limitless variability as guided by natural selection. Thus, they believe that all creatures could come from a very primitive original organism. Well, we say no, the finches merely exhibited a limited amount of inbuilt variability. Thus, there are definite limits to a finch's ability to vary. There's no increase in genetic information. Finches never bear non-finches, and selective breeding experiments show that variations among the created kind are definitely limited. You can think of dogs. You can breed dogs out to get to a purebred dog. Once you get there, where are you going to go? The genetics are already strung out as far as you can go. You're never going to get something other than a dog coming from a dog. Our third disagreement: how long did it take for the finches to speciate from the original finch ancestors? Evolutionists say 2 million years. And they believe that organisms cannot speciate too rapidly because evolution takes a lot of time for mutations to drive natural selection, because this information has to be built up. Well, we say this would have happened very rapidly, sometime less than 4,500 years ago after the flood, and speciation can happen very rapidly because the genetic information is already there, and thus all you're having to do is introduce slight changes, variability in the genetics, and sometimes even mutations that break apart the already pre-built genetics and allow this variation to come to play. Here are some evolutionary predictions of future finches with the right selection pressures. I particularly like the logger finch. Now, believing in supernatural creation and rejecting in evolution does not mean believing in fixity of species. Holy Scripture speaks about created kinds, and the examples we have today of the various kinds of animals are probably not identical to the originally created kind. Animals do change over time, and dogs, again, are a great example. The original dog kind would have been like kind of a wolf creature that all dogs have come from, but the essence of that creature doesn't change. Similarly, Adam and Eve contained all the genetic information for all of the races of men within them, and thus they were the perfect composite of all races. And we must be careful not to confuse the term kinds with modern-day species, because there are many species that are labeled as such today that can actually interbreed. And if a species can interbreed with another species, then we would consider that part of the originally created kind. At the present time, that's our best guess, our best way of determining what probably constituted an originally created kind. If these creatures can interbreed, and they most likely were one and the same created kind. Wolves and dogs can interbreed. Horses, donkeys, and zebras can interbreed. Llamas and camels can interbreed. Dolphins and false killer whales can interbreed. You know what this is? It's a camma. It's a camel-llama hybrid. Yeah. And what's this one? It's a zorse, right? A zebra horse. And this is my daughter Cassia when she was small, and she's standing in front of some silhouettes of different birds: eagle, a hawk, a harrier, a kestrel. And the eagle, the hawk, and the harrier, it's possible that all of those were one originally created kind. There's some evidence genetically that a kestrel or a falcon may have been a different created kind. But we don't really have a problem with these similar types of species originally being one created kind, because their essence, their nature, is essentially the same. Here again is that tree of death, and I'm showing that because I'm going to be talking about these ideas of phylogenetic trees. You see various examples of those trees of life in scientific literature, where they're attempting to show you what evolved into what. But here's a candid admission by Geir Hesmark, a professor of biology and history of science at the University of Oslo. He's an evolutionist, but he says phylogenetic trees are common in today's scientific journals, but it is seldom realized how speculative they are because they look so real. The inherently imperfect nature of the evidence seems to guarantee we will never be able to reconstruct, except perhaps by accident, the true phylogeny of life on Earth. This is Stephen Jay Gould, at one time probably the world's most famous evolutionist. And he says the evolutionary trees that adorn our textbooks have data only at the tips and nodes of their branches. The rest is inference, however reasonable, not the evidence of fossils. When you look back in the fossil record, you see all of these different creatures appearing at the same time, and that has been labeled the Cambrian explosion. And according to secular chronologies, they say it happened around 550 million years ago. And this is a quote from Peter Ward, paleontologist and professor of biology, earth, and space sciences at the University of Adelaide, and Donald Brownlee, professor of astronomy at the University of Washington. For all the animal phyla to appear in one single short burst of diversification is not an obviously predictable outcome of evolution. The Cambrian explosion marked not only the start of the majority of phyla, as recognized in the fossil record, but also the end of evolutionary innovation at the phyla level. Since the Cambrian, not a single new phylum has evolved. The extraordinary fact is that the diversification of new animal body plans started and ended during the Cambrian period. That's strange for a process that's supposedly happening in just the same way today as it was supposedly 550 million years ago. According to James Valentine, professor emeritus at the Department of Integrative Biology at the University of California, Berkeley, it has so far proven impossible to trace in the fossil record the pathways of change that led to the body plans of any of the phyla. All are cryptogenetic. What does that word mean? Of unknown or undetermined origin, cause, or ancestry. Again, these are all quotes from evolutionists. So this single tree of life really doesn't reflect the findings of science, and of course it doesn't reflect the findings of Holy Scripture either. But as Hugh said, an orchard model is a much better one, where we have limited diversification from many different originally created kinds, and this is consistent with science and Holy Scripture. Well, let's switch gears from evolutionists to creationists. These are quotes from Dr. Sanford and Dr. Carter, two creation scientists. The scientific consensus as it stands today will reject any and all evidence for literal Adam and Eve. The popular ideas that dominate the current scientific subculture must not be confused with either the scientific method itself or objective truth. At this moment, the majority of Western scientists are militantly promoting sexual liberation, abortion, and sodomy. I think we can all agree with that. Moreover, they are generally hostile to Jesus, the Bible, and the Church. So let's talk about genetic entropy. Dr. Sanford, whose picture was on that last slide, he coined this term. And this is the genetic degeneration of living things. It's the systematic breakdown of the internal biological information systems that make life alive. And this is what we are observing from generation to generation. When the theories of evolution were invented back in Darwin's day, they had no idea about genetics. Now that we're able to examine the amount of mutations that are passed from one generation to the next, it turns out that there's approximately 100 new mutations from one generation to the next. So each generation is becoming more mutant than the last. And this is happening through errors in our instruction manual DNA. Our DNA is very similar to a computer code, a highly advanced one. And when you introduce errors into a computer code, you're going to have problems. And we're getting more and more errors in our code. Now, our code is over 3 billion letters long, so 100 mutations per generation is still going to take a while before that reaches catastrophic proportions, but that is what's happening. We're not getting better, we're getting worse biologically. These mutations, they're systematically eroding the information that encodes life's many essential functions. And that's what DNA is. It's just a language that is conveying biologic information. And these random mutations, they're systematically scrambling these specifications, gradually and relentlessly destroying the programming instructions essential to life. Our cells become more mutant and more divergent from each other every day. I read one estimate the other day that we have 130 trillion mutations that happen per year in each of us. However, only 100 or so get fixed and carried on to the next generation. By the time we're old, our cells have accumulated, this is an old slide, tens of thousands, but even more than that. Mutation accumulation is the primary reason we grow old and die. And so again, we pass some of these mutations to our children, and mutations are thus continuously increasing, accumulating in the population, with each generation being more mutant than the last. So not only are we undergoing this degeneration personally, we're undergoing genetic degeneration at a population level, and this is evolution going the wrong way, devolution. Natural selection can slow down this process by killing out the worst of the worst, but it cannot stop genetic entropy. Natural selection eliminates, it doesn't increase information, it doesn't replace the lost genetics. Now some say, well, why can't natural selection stop genetic entropy? Evolutionists often assume most mutations are neutral. They think that these mutations can accumulate because they're not really harming anything, they're just having a neutral effect. They would say, even though the mutations are happening, we often can't measure an effect on fitness from these mutations. And that's true. There's some experiments that evolutionists have run, they can't detect that, and there's a good reason why. If we could measure fitness decline, then we agree. There would be enough detrimental effect of these mutations that natural selection could weed it out. However, it may take hundreds of fixed mutations before you have an experimentally verifiable fitness effect. So these mutations most of them are nearly neutral. In other words, they're having a slightly detrimental effect that isn't something that natural selection can see to weed out. And so these slightly neutral effects are going to build up, and the creature's not going to die from it until it builds up bad enough that natural selection could eliminate it, but by that time it's already been fixed into the population. Evolutionists also think most DNA is effectively junk and useless, and that only a small portion of DNA is useful to us unless they think that mutations can build up in that useless DNA without it having an effect on us. And this has been proven to be false. The genome is basically, like I said, a computer code, and so mutations will degrade it. There's junk DNA is proven to be a myth. Our genome is mostly functional. And so if our DNA is mostly useful, then mutations are mostly going to be having a negative effect, obviously. Even in a worst case scenario where something changes and it doesn't seem to be having an effect, your body's still wasting resources to copy that code, and so it would have a slightly detrimental effect. And so you can see that the more you think about this, the more of a problem this is for evolution. We can talk a little bit about information. Information and information systems always degenerate unless an intelligent agent corrects this. This is obviously true in the human realm, but it's equally true in the biological realm. And again, DNA is just an instrument to convey information. Generally speaking, entropy is simply a measure of disorder. And we know that all functional systems degenerate, moving from order to disorder, apart from outside intervention, because entropy always increases in an enclosed system. There's a universal tendency for all biological information systems to degrade, to degenerate over time, apart from intelligent intervention. And there's no intelligent intervention correcting these errors in the DNA. As I said, there appear to be about 100 new fixed mutations per generation. Some studies have given slightly different numbers on that. Some say 60, but at any rate, virtually all are harmful. And a quote from Dr. Sanford, he contacted Kondrashov, who is an evolutionist geneticist who studies populations and is an expert on this subject. And it says, he has advised me that virtually all the human geneticists he knows agree that man is degenerating genetically. That paper, and but they're talking about this other geneticist, Lynch, indicates human fitness is declining at 3 to 5% per generation. And Sanford thinks that's too high, but he says we at least agree that fitness is going down, not up. There's really no debate on current human genetic degeneration. And so, talk to, according to Dr. Sanford, he's talked to a lot of different geneticists. They're experts at this type of thing at a population level, and they agree that this is definitely a problem, at least for humans. They haven't really studied the animals as much, even though this certainly does appear to be happening, not just in humans, but all life. And one way that they showed that to the kids is Sanford and Carter did some experiments on H1N1 virus, because that is one thing that they have a really good genetic record of over time, because these samples have been frozen in labs. They can pull out these samples and test their genetics. And they found that genetic entropy was happening in that virus over the last 100 years. Now, this is a graph where the fitness of humans has been simulated, and this is mutation accumulation over 200 generations with a biologically realistic human population of 10,000 individuals, and they inputted a mutation rate of 100 per generation. It's a program called Mendel's Accountant. And this is a comprehensive numerical simulation program that tracks deleterious mutations or harmful mutations as they accumulate in a population in the presence of a very strong natural selection. They inputted into this particular program an elimination of the worst half of children. So basically, if there were 4 children born, you'd have 2 that died off, so that they're really giving evolution a chance, or natural selection a chance to kill off the worst of the worst. And yet, even doing that, with this 100 mutations per generation, you see this biologic decay curve where at the start, you have perfect fitness, and then 200 generations later, you're down to less than 20% the fitness or the ability to reproduce and thrive that you had in the beginning. What's really interesting about this is how well it lines up with the declining lifespans of Noah's descendants. On the right is a plot of the various ages to which the descendants of Noah lived as recorded in Scripture. And you can see that it appears to fit a biologic decay curve as well. And so either this is true, it certainly seems to give credence to these numbers, or it would take perhaps some sort of genius to input these supposedly fake numbers to be able to produce a biologic decay curve like this. It certainly validates the numbers, in my opinion. want to talk a little bit about mitochondrial Eve, and this is genetic evidence of a literal Eve, the mother of us all. So all geneticists now agree that we have one mother of us all. Over 800 mitochondrial DNA sequences have been analyzed, and a very close approximation of Eve's mitochondrial DNA sequence has been reconstructed. The average human being has diverged from the original Eve sequence by only 22 mutations. How did they determine this? Well, basically, you take all 800, you figure out where they have similarities, and if they're all similar, then you assume, okay, this is part of the original DNA, and then you see where the mutations happen, and you can analyze and determine what was a mutation and what wasn't. And so this is a plot with the bullseye in the middle representing the perfect sequence, and it turns out that, again, people are about 22 mutations removed in the mitochondrial DNA. It should be explained that mitochondrial DNA is a separate repository of DNA in the mitochondria, not in the nucleus of the cell, and it comes down from the maternal line. And so it's a really interesting way of analyzing mutations because the genome is much smaller. It's only about 16,500 segments compared to the billions in the nucleus of the cell. So the mutation rate within human mitochondrial DNA appears to be about 0.16 mutations per generation. That has been determined by analyzing basically progeny of people. So pedigree analyses. So you basically take a mother to a daughter, and you would be able to do a whole bunch of those and determine, okay, how many mutations are happening from one generation to the next on average. It's about 0.16 mutations per generation. So to get to the 22 mutation average, this would take about 137.5 generations using those two numbers. And interestingly, if you add up the people in the genealogy in Luke chapter 3, there's 75 generations from Adam to Christ. It's 2024 right now. So if we divide that by, say, a 32-year average generation time, we get 63.25 generations. So if you add those 75 plus that number, you get a number remarkably similar to that number from the that I just told you. So it lines up absolutely perfectly with Scripture, that the mutation rate going back to a perfect Eve. The fact that there is a singular mother of us all, mitochondrial Eve, is common to all humans, regardless of race, and whose mitochondrial sequence is readily recognized within all humans, correlates, as I said, extremely well with Holy Scripture and tradition, which tells us that all people can trace their ancestry to a single woman, Eve. And evolutionary theory absolutely did not predict this. As modern man's ancestors first came out of Africa 1 million years ago and diverged into Homo erectus populations in Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and over this much time, they would have accumulated many more mutations and would have caused each continent to have its own distinctive mitochondrial sequence, but we simply don't see that at all. So we can conclude from this, a real woman who lived less than 10,000 years ago is the mother of all humanity. We know her mitochondrial DNA sequence, and within each one of us is a slightly mutated version of her original sequence. And evolutionists are the ones that call her Eve, and we can certainly agree with that. Now, we can do this same basic type of thing with the paternal line through Y chromosomes, because only men have Y chromosomes, and this is genetic evidence for a literal Adam, the father of us all. And all geneticists now agree that there's only one paternal ancestor for all people on Earth. And evolutionists coined the term originally Y chromosome Adam. They later came to regret that and now use the term most recent common ancestor. The Y chromosomes of more than 1,200 men were analyzed, and using the same sort of methods, the original Y chromosome Adam sequence was constructed. It turns out the Y chromosomes of most modern men are less than 500 mutations removed from Y chromosome Adam. The reason why it's more than the mitochondrial analysis is because there's just much more DNA in the Y chromosome than in the mitochondria. Now, if evolution was true, based on the observed numbers, we would expect to see 20,000 to 30,000 mutational differences, not 500. This is 40 to 60 times different. The biblical time frame, though, fits exceptionally well with known mutation rates because, again, through analyzing father to son pairs and determining how many mutations are passed down, they found that it's about 2 to 3 mutations on average per generation, and this works perfectly with the amount of generations that would be from Adam until now, which, again, based on that other slide and my own calculations, it's about 135 to 145 generations, maybe 150 generations. It's possible it could be more than that, 200, but at any rate, it's not a lot of generations tracing you back to Adam and Eve. Thus, a real man who lived less than 10,000 years ago is the father of all humanity. We know his Y chromosome sequence, and within each male alive today, there's a slightly mutated version of this original DNA sequence. Although in the case of mitochondrial evolutionists, called him Adam, and we can agree with that. Now, the extreme similarity across the genome shows that there really aren't any race distinctions. There's only just the human race. The genomes of any two random people on Earth are 99.9% similar. And skin color, it turns out, is a poor predictor of actual genetic relatedness. So we can't even really justify the use of the term race. And this has been a very big surprise to evolutionists, because evolution predicted an extreme difference amongst the different races because they thought that they had lived separately for so many years. But it turns out there's very little human genetic diversity, which fits very well with a short time span. Darwin was a very big racist. The subtitle of his book was Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. He wrote, at some future period not very distant as measured by centuries, civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. And Haeckel, Hugh spoke about Ernst Haeckel, he wrote, these lower races, such as the Vedas or Australian Negroes, are psychologically nearer to the mammals, apes, or dogs, than civilized Europeans. We must therefore assign a totally different value to their lives. So you can see how the evolution mindset does really breed racism. According to Sanford and Carter, the actual genetic evidence makes it clear that we are one race. We come from a narrow genetic base. The source population lived quite recently, and that people groups diverged much more recently than previously thought. Of course, there's other evidences that refute evolution. The fact that we can write books, poetry, music, programs, that we can pray, self-awareness, expressions of true love, creations of art. Since we know our genome, our genes are like executable computer programs, none of these unique characteristics could come about through random typographical mistakes filtered by natural selection. That's absurd. So our unique human qualities are, of course, not evolvable. You may have heard the statement that chimps and humans are 98 to 99% similar. Turns out that is absolutely wrong. New studies confirm there's only about an 84% similarity, and that means that they were off by a significant amount, because a 1 to 2% difference all of a sudden is a 16% difference. And to put that into perspective, apparently we are 50% similar genetically to bananas. So it suddenly 16% doesn't seem that bad. Why is that? Well, the reason is the same reason that we have arms and legs like other creatures do, because we have a common designer, and a common designer also of the DNA that made the living creatures. There's another big problem for evolution. It's the waiting time problem. We have all of these genetic changes that supposedly occurred that would have changed an ape-like creature into a human over 6 million years. The amount of information that these genetic changes would require would fill about 160,000 pages if you just typed out the letters with no spaces between them. Comprehensive numerical simulators have been developed which can replicate the mutation selection process, and turns out for a string of 8 letters to change and fix itself in the population, it would take 65 billion years for this genetic change to occur. And this is 8 letters out of 160,000 pages of information that would need to be changed. Now, I mentioned junk DNA before. That was something I was taught in university and genetics class, that our genome was filled with useless junk. They said 98% of our genome was useless junk, and there's only 2% useful. And the evolutionists liked this because, again, the mutations that were harmful could just build up in the junk and it wouldn't harm us, according to the hypothesis. This was also used as an argument against God, because why would God be the author of a junky genome? Well, in 2012, the phase 2 of the Human Genome Project was completed. This was a multi-million-dollar international study, and it was tasked with determining how much of the genome was active. There were 400 plus ENCODE scientists, and they discovered that most of the human genome, even what was previously referred to as junk DNA, is actually used. And it turns out that the different parts of the gene can be used for building many different proteins, so that any gene is composed of multi-purpose building blocks. And even the genes that don't code for proteins, the DNA has other regulatory functions. Instead of it being just a protein-generating engine, the genome can now be seen as an RNA computer doing multiple calculations, primarily within the so-called junk regions of the genome. So within any given stretch of human DNA, there are multiple overlapping codes, meaning that any change to a specific letter could affect multiple different genetic messages. And Darwinian evolution simply can't account for the origin or preservation of these overlapping codes. So mainstream science, the ENCODE project, a wealth of data produced over the last decade, has falsified this myth that most of the genome was junk. When the latest ENCODE results were published, a Science magazine article appeared and said, ENCODE project writes eulogy for junk DNA. And a senior scientist with ENCODE said almost every nucleotide or genetic letter is associated with a function of some sort or another. We now know where they are, what binds to them, what their associations are, and more. And this is a screenshot of that article in Science. So the parts of our genome that were thought to be junk DNA are actually essential for life. And this is something most Darwinists simply haven't come to grips with. And the refusal to show what the data is currently showing is not because of sound science, it's because they have an ideological problem with this idea. And they have a commitment to Darwinism. They are well aware that the collapse of the junk DNA story is a death blow to Darwinian evolution theory. And one ardent evolutionary advocate and scientist, Dan Brower, has gone on record saying if the human genome is indeed devoid of junk DNA, as implied by the ENCODE project, and a long undirected evolutionary process cannot explain the human genome. If ENCODE is right, then evolution is wrong. This was just a screenshot of a study I read the other day showing that they're finding out again that these mutations are far more harmful than they thought they were. In the past, they called synonymous mutations silent mutations, but now they can't call them that anymore because they're finding that these mutations have a very harmful effect. So to summarize, contrary to popular notion, a close evaluation of the theory of evolution shows that its supposed mechanisms do not result in the production of increasingly complex generations of organisms. While we do observe horizontal variation among created kinds, we do not observe the upward increase in complexity needed to prove evolution. And without the production of countless new segments of information within the genome, evolution simply doesn't have the power to create or proceed in an upward fashion. Though natural selection has a real effect, it has no creative power. So true science, or knowledge, because that's what the word science means, does not support evolution. We've seen that there are abundant reasons within natural science alone to reject the theory of evolution. We need not wonder what origins model to turn to. God in his inerrant word has told us how he made our first parents. Isaiah 45, I made the earth, and I created man upon it. My hand stretched forth the heavens, and I have commanded all their hosts. Jeremiah 27, I made the earth, and the men and the beasts that are upon the face of the earth, by my great power, and by my stretched out arm, and I have given it to whom it seemed good in my eyes. 2 Maccabees 7, but the creator of the world that formed the nativity of man, and that found out the origin of all, he will restore to you again in his mercy, both breath and life, as now you despise yourselves for the sake of his laws. And again, that's a typo there, but 2 Maccabees, I beseech thee, my son, look upon heaven and earth and all that is in them, and consider that God made them out of nothing, and mankind also. And Tobias 8, thou madest Adam of the slime of the earth, and gavest him Eve for a helper. All right. That's it for me. So. Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. O Mary, conceived without sin. Pray for us who are first. Amen. All right.